Hello and welcome back to our Friday fireside chats here at Question Pro. Today we've got a great guest with us, Annett Pecher, who is the co-founder and CEO of Emotional Logic, which is a research agency here in the northeast of England that specializes specifically on behavioral science, which I think is going to be a really, really great topic for all the listeners today. I know it's one that a lot of people are kind of thinking about, how do we get on the bleeding edge? What are these new methodologies? And Annett and Emotional Logic have actually won 5 research awards in these kind of categories around behavioral research. And so this is going to be a really good topic, the right person to learn from to stay on the cutting edge. Annett, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, and looking forward to having a bit of a chat on this lovely Friday.
Fantastic. Well, tell us, Annett, tell us a little bit more about Emotional Logic. I mean, you've got these 5 awards. Maybe you can give us an example of kind of some of these studies and these methodologies that you're kind of helping clients with each and every day.
Yes, definitely. So where our methodologies have come from is we were aware that when the company was founded in 2007, a lot of research was focusing mostly on sort of rational behavior and things that people are very conscious of. And yet brand development, advertising, packaging design all asks for emotional connection. We know that emotional connection important to get a result with the consumer. So we looked outside of market research into other areas such as neuroscience, psychology. We looked at the tools that are used there to measure emotions, to identify motivations. Now, the challenge that we had with some of those tools is that a lot of them were not very user-friendly. So in social psychology, you might get a tool where you've got to fill in 30 questions. So that's not really practical in commercial research. So we've done those tools, we've adapted them for using with respondents. So it's an enjoyable user experience, that it's fast and easy to implement. And yes, we've integrated those tools into our tool set to enable us to measure some more of the unconscious factors that influence consumer behavior.
Fantastic. Well, I will definitely spend some time getting into kind of the tools and the tangibles, how you actually do these things. But I want to come back to that kind of original assumption that you found back in 2007, right? That, hey, these things are really driven by emotions, right? And I think that, there's kind of always been that survey question, right? How does this make you feel? Sad, angry, mad? Like when did you kind of realize that, that's not going to do it? That just asking that question about emotion is really not what we're looking for. Tell us a little bit about kind of where that insight came from and how you measured that.
Well, I think the challenge that we have is that a lot of the things that we're talking about in a sort of marketing or brand context, the emotions aren't quite as powerful as the big emotions that we might have about people. So when we say we love a person, that's very different to the way we love a brand. So a lot of the time when we're asking people, a lot of the times the answer is, I don't feel anything. I don't feel anything about my bank. Why should I feel anything about my bank? So the emotions are so small that they are very difficult to measure. And that's when we started thinking, we know that people feel something, but how do we get to this? And neuroscience is a great way. So we're using things like galvanic skin response, also eye tracking in terms of engagement with material that can give us a bit more of that information as to what engages people, what do people connect with. And then through that, we can then open up the conversation with them to say, we know you looked at this for a long time. Tell us your thoughts about this image. I mean, how do you feel about this image? And it helps open up that conversation with the respondent and get us more information about those feelings that people are having about brands and products.
Interesting. So that's a really good insight, right? That, we're talking about a brand. I don't love or hate, my bank. It's my bank. It's where I put the money. You're kind of talking about some of these different kind of technologies and tools that kind of come from neuroscience, right? So, skin response, it's amazing that we can even track those types of things, eye tracking. Before we get into kind of the ways that you can track it, tell us a little bit about how you think about the stimuli, right? So what do you put in front of somebody to then judge what their emotion is towards that bank? Is it, hey, here's an image? Is it, I actually want to be with you when you go into that bank? How do you think about the stimuli? And then we'll kind of talk about how you measure the different kind of emotional sides of it.
Yes, you can really get close to the real life situation. So if you can actually be with the person in the moment, that is the ideal scenario. That's not always possible, but yes, we do try with our clients to get as close to that as we can. So for example, we might do a home study where people are in their homes, they're going to experience that in their real environment, maybe dinner party, they're trying a new food product. We try to get as close to that as possible when we're actually measuring things. But when we measure with stimulus sort of afterwards, we try to put in context. So rather than just showing an advert, asking people to watch a video in the middle of which happens to be an advert, where you can really get closer to the real life situation. I think the closer we can get to that, the more accurate our measurements are going to be.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So let's kind of take those maybe 3 examples, right? So you've kind of got the in-store, the physical experience itself, where you're actually kind of walking into an environment. You've got the more at-home experience, right? I'm unboxing a product or kind of feeling a product for the first time. And then you kind of have this more like video experience, right? Like digitally interactive, similar to what you would see with a TV ad, and that will make you feel something as well. So if you kind of look at those 3 examples, then how do you go about the measurement? I imagine it's much, much different for the in-person scenario than the video scenario. How do you think about the actual measurement of those different pieces?
So if we, so eye tracking is a good example of a technology that's really come on a long way in the last few years. It's a lot more accurate. It's a lot more flexible than it used to be. So we're now able to integrate that into all of those scenarios. So we are able to have mobile eye tracking with glasses, where we can ask people to go into a store and pick a drink off a shelf, and we'll be able to see actually what people looked at. We can see which packaging attracted attention more quickly. We can also see what else they took in of the environment and how they made that decision. And we found by doing that people do a lot more than they remember. So when we used to do intercept research a long time ago, we used to ask people about what they have just done, and most people have just forgotten. They just remember the product they end up with. They don't remember all the other ones they looked at. So eye tracking really opens up a lot more information for us.
Wow. So these are glasses that the participant is actually viewing, or is it an interviewer that's with the participant and the interviewer is wearing the glasses?
Yes, it's the participant is actually wearing. Yeah,
Amazing.
So it's great technology.
That's fantastic. Well, this wasn't prompted, but we've got Adam Sellery here saying hi, who's also in kind of the eye tracking world, from founder of Real Eye, building out some of these technologies. Tell us about kind of eye tracking in some of the other scenarios. So we've got the glasses where you're kind of going into the store. How about the in-home test versus the video test? How do you think about those 2 pieces?
So again, at home, we can ask people to wear the glasses. We also use galvanic skin response, which we can use by people when they're at home, and that can be combined with ethnographic research. So we can both have qual research, but we can also measure the neuroscience components. And then yes, we use online eye tracking. We actually do use Real Eye. So that is a platform that we use. And that enables us to build it into surveys. So we could have some traditional survey questions on the platform, and then we could integrate an eye tracking test. And to the end user, it's a sort of seamless experience. Right. That's one of the things we love about Question Pro, is the flexibility to be able to do that, to have that seamless experience for the respondent to integrate those elements.
Right. And then at that point, you're kind of mixing the qual and the quant, right? So you're able to kind of get Real Eye integrated with Question Pro, but then still pull in those initial questions and then kind of segment the data from the qualitative side to say, well, what was the emotional response for males versus females versus different age groups, and kind of combine that and package it into one. Tell us how that works on the analysis side. So, it seems like it's probably, depending on each of these kind of 3 scenarios, you might be more on the qualitative side versus the quantitative side. Do you kind of have an approach to analysis when you think about, what are you looking for in the eye tracking or the skin response? How does that work?
Well, the analysis is really driven by the research problem. So when a client comes to us, we will look at their particular situation. So they'll have a particular research problem, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
That research problem will have quant and qual components usually, will have conscious and unconscious components usually.
Right.
So we put the methodology together to measure all of those things. And we already know what effects we're looking for, what effects we'll be measuring. Then in the analysis, we simply bring all that together. So we cross-reference all the information, the quant and the qual, to look at the decision basically. So the decision process or the reaction of the consumer. We identify all the different elements that play a part, and also, so what are the tipping points? When does the rational mind kick in? When do the emotions kick in? And that's the type of sort of insight that we will then feed back to our clients, who get one report that sort of brings it all together for them.
Interesting, right? So there's the kind of the explicit, what are they telling us, and the implicit, what's their eyes saying, what's their skin saying, what's the kind of emotional reaction. Do you kind of find now that like almost every study that you do kind of needs both components, that you can't really always trust the explicit? Is that kind of how you run the practice now, that, hey, if we're going to do a study, you kind of need both?
Yes, because we've seen so many discrepancies as to what people said.
Really?
Actually happened. I mean, there's so many examples where people have said, "Oh, I didn't look at this picture," and then in the eye tracking, very clearly they all looked at this picture. So, there's so it's just simply that a lot of the things are not really important enough to store in a long-term memory. So people just simply forget that they looked at it. And so it's not that they're intentionally not wanting to disclose the information, they simply don't remember. So yes, most of our studies now have a component that is neuroscience, or somewhere where we're trying to get behind what people are saying and actually finding out for ourselves.
Interesting. What do you do in that case, right? So when you see such a big division between the explicit and the implicit, right? That, hey, everybody told me that they didn't see this picture, but then clearly the eye tracking says that they did. Do you just throw out the explicit data at that point and say, hey, all we can trust is the implicit? Like where does the explicit data then come into play for those types of scenarios?
So we would, if it is something that could have an impact on the purchase decision, for example, we would recommend to the client to test that. So I can give an example. So we worked with Revlon on designing some fixtures, and the majority of people said that they weren't looking at the pictures of the models that were on the stand. They were just interested in the product. So over years, they had removed or had reduced the number of models. And then we did an eye tracking study, and the majority of the time, people were actually looking at the models of the products, and they kept flicking between looking at the product, looking at the model, looking at the product. So clearly that phase played a big part in the purchase decision. People sort of maybe imagining themselves wearing the makeup and wanted something to sort of compare that against. So we recommended to test that, because there was a big discrepancy between what people said and what actually happened. And when they did test it, those fixtures performed better with the faces on, in terms of sales and in terms of engagement with the product. So we wouldn't always say implicit is better than explicit, but I think it's worth to have that information, so that you can then maybe test some scenarios and try some different options.
Right. I mean, that is such a good example, right? I mean, it makes complete sense, right? When people think about, the beauty space, and everybody kind of gets a little bit of an ego involved with the explicit. No, I don't care what other people look like. I'm just thinking about this for me. But then clearly, we're all human. You're buying a beauty product. You want to see what it looks like on somebody, right? What it can do. I think that's a great example of where the emotional tracking comes in, and where these kind of technologies can fit in. I think we all have to be honest with ourselves, though, that, it does add complexity to the research. It might add some costs, right? There's more logistics involved and things like that. How do you think about that side in terms of the components of, when do you involve this? Which kind of methodology do we use? Maybe you can just talk a little bit about that kind of investment and complexity, and where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense.
Definitely. We have seen a big increase in complexity of the briefs that we are getting from clients in terms of the stakes are getting higher in terms of the research questions that need to be answered. And we need increasingly complex methodologies to answer those questions. Yes, with that does come an investment.
Right.
I think it's really important to be also realistic and be honest with the client if they have 20 research questions, to maybe say, well, which of these are really essential, so that we focus our activities on that, and then maybe add some components for the slightly less important questions. But yes, generally, I think the other element that can really help us with keeping the costs down and also making the processes smoother is standardization. So, for example, on our user experience testing for websites, we've now got a standard process. So we know exactly what we're looking for. We know exactly which parameter we're looking for and what we're measuring. So that's made the process that was initially really complex, simpler, a lot easier to use, and also more affordable for clients. So yes, I think over time, standardization also helps with that.
Right. And it's a good point too, right? Even just in these three examples that we're talking about, you kind of have this gradient in terms of how much the investment could be, right? If you're doing in person with the glasses, with the skin tracking, versus online survey, and the webcam just pops on and you can do the eye tracking that way, right? You can kind of have these different kind of levels. Duncan is bringing up a great point here, though. Where does the kind of moderator, the interviewer come into play in this, right? So, they're human. They can also judge emotions. They can prompt people to kind of have different emotions. Tell us about kind of the moderator, the interviewer, and how that plays a role in the emotional tracking.
Definitely, that is another way that we also do research. While we're saying that consumers aren't always conscious of their emotions, they can be made conscious of that. So we've got an interview process where our moderators help people to make those emotions conscious. So very similar to maybe a coaching session that somebody would have. Somebody might not know why they're doing a certain problematic behavior, but once they talk to a coach, very quickly you learn and you realize why you're doing it. And everything that we do in life is driven by emotion. We're either moving towards a positive emotion, so where we want to be happy or we want to be relaxed, or we're trying to move away from a negative emotion. We don't want to be stressed or we don't want to be fearful. So that's really what it comes down to. So there's questioning techniques that can be used to help people realize why they're doing what they're doing. There is an interviewer bias, which can be overcome to a certain extent by having a team of moderators. So so that we have a good diversity in the team as well, people from different backgrounds with different experience and skills within the moderator team, so that in the overall data set you've got that moderated. And there's also training that you can do to make sure that we phrase our questions neutral, that we don't implant thoughts into the person's head, and that we phrase the questions as neutral as possible. But an element of that remains, and I think that human insight is also a benefit. So that is something that, for example, machine learning is a big other area that's going on at the moment. That's an element that machines cannot replicate as yet. Right. So having that human insight is really beneficial.
Right. I mean, I think it's a good point, right? And in terms of where we're getting in terms of technology, I think you're seeing AI and kind of emotional detection being able to get better at detecting the emotions, but prompting the emotions. That AI isn't going to know where to take the conversation, right? To kind of prompt them. And I think Duncan's got a good follow-up here, right? And you kind of talked about training the moderators. I imagine that the training here for the moderators is much more complex than kind of traditionally, right? I mean, traditionally you kind of get some interviewers. They may be relatively junior, right? Because you've got to spread them out geographically, and they're just kind of following a script, right? That says, okay, ask this question, ask this question, ask this question. It almost seems like what you're talking about is like, it's a little bit more complicated, right? It's almost like you're almost becoming like a psychiatrist in some ways, right? Okay, when do I press on the happy emotion? When do I press on the sad emotion? What's the tonality that I use when I ask the question or ask somebody to go in and do a certain thing in a store? What does that investment in training look like? How do you make sure that your interviewers are kind of doing the right things out there from an emotional perspective?
So there's traditional interview training that we do, so it's call research training, just in terms of building rapport with the person and how to ask the questions. But then we do regular workshops with members of staff to help. Well, if you understand your own emotions better, then you are better at recognizing them in other people.
Right.
So a lot of the work that we do is actually learning about ourselves rather than necessarily learning the interview techniques. So we've got psychology-based research that we bring in, and where we do workshops with people to help them understand that. But a lot of the time, I have to say, it's also just about repeating the question. So if you repeat the question enough times, eventually the person will open up more. And actually answer it, which is the same technique that is used in sort of psychoanalysis, just basically being perseverance and keeping going.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's the way you ask it, it's how many times you ask it, it's what did your phrase? But I think that's a great point. It's like it starts with, do you even understand your own emotions? Right. And I mean, well, listen, we all have a bad day. Sometimes we wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Right. And if that moderator is coming in and is just in a bad mood, right, you may actually kind of get, different emotions coming off of the participants and the research subjects. That's, I think, a key insight, right, is that the moderator has to kind of at least be somewhat in tune with their own emotions going into the practice.
Yeah.
I mean, Annett, clearly you've really, really honed in on this space since 2007 and really kind of figured out, okay, how do you kind of understand emotions and integrate this into the research process? Where do you see the space going, right? So, I mean, clearly it's come such a long way. The technologies have really, evolved. You've come up with the best practices around, the interviewers and how to train people and what the stimuli should be. What's next, right? As you look at the next kind of 5 years in emotional detection, emotional research, where do you see the space going?
I think it's a very exciting time. I do think that a lot of the techniques are improving. They're becoming more practical. They're becoming more usable. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing. So some of the things that are currently maybe still sci-fi will become integrated into the research process. And for us, it's just a matter of keeping an eye out about everything that's going on out there, because things are changing and things are improving all the time. And we're as an organization, we're very innovative and love trying out new tools. So I know the team always gets very excited if they find something new, and we'll bring it in, do a small pilot just for us, just to see.
Right.
Yeah, that sort of process is very exciting. And I think, as we've seen, as mentioned, eye tracking has come on a long way. There's some other neuroscience techniques that I think at the moment are still not very practical, but they will be. Technology will improve. They will become more practical, more affordable, and it will give us more insight into how the mind works and how people really make decisions and how they really react.
Yeah, I mean, you see some of this stuff that's happening in kind of the medical healthcare space, right? In terms of imaging and MRIs and being able to really kind of detect which part of the brain is lighting up to different stimuli. But, I mean, we've talked a lot about eye tracking, right? Where are your eyes? How much time are you spending in different locations? The one that's probably, feels really kind of cutting edge to me, and it sounds like you've got some experience with, is the skin detection, right? And how does that work? What are you kind of looking for in that? Is it heart rate? Is it, sweat levels? Like what do you look for on the skin side of things?
So the one of the areas of detecting emotions is physiological changes, and yes, heart rate is one of them. Our heart rate changes, but also yes, sweat is the other one. On your harms, which can be just minute changes that you wouldn't even feel yourself, that can be measured there. The challenge that we have with heart rate variability is that you need quite a long period of time to take an actual measurement, and lots of things can have an impact. So the temperature of the room can have an impact, where the person sitting, standing can have an impact. So it's got lots of variables that influence it, and if you think that you might need 2 minutes of data to actually come to a conclusion, well, an advert might only be 30 seconds long. So there are some challenges with pinning the physiological change to the stimulus still. Right. Galvanic skin response is something that can get us closer to that, because it can be pinpointed more precisely. But it only gives you a reading as to something happened. We won't actually know what that emotion is. So we still need to speak to the person to find out what the emotion actually was. But we can pinpoint the moment when it happened, and we can pinpoint that to a particular stimulus. So that's really helpful from that point of view.
Tell us maybe an example, real or hypothetical, where the kind of skin response comes into play, right? You gave us a great example on the eye tracking, Revlon. Are you looking at the human? Are you not looking at the human on the packaging? Where does the skin, what's a good example of where to use the skin response technology?
We use galvanic skin response when we're testing advertising. So effectiveness of advertising. So you might want to, you may have an advert where you want to also produce some digital or some outdoor campaigns, and you want to know which part of your 30-second advert is actually the moment where most people are engaged. So a combination of eye tracking and galvanic skin response can tell us that. So we can actually identify a particular frame to say that's the moment when the arch is the highest and the reaction is the strongest, and then it makes sense to use that particular one to roll out to other areas of the campaign.
That's so interesting. Finding that hero point in 30 seconds, right? Where does the emotion really peak? Where do you have their kind of biggest attention? But what is it that you're looking for in the skin response? I mean, at that, 21-second frame, right? Is it they're sweating more, they've got a higher heart rate, their skin is warmer? Does it really work at that level?
It does, yes. It is sweat that is being measured, and it measures the sensors are extremely sensitive. They can measure minute changes in that, and that's what it measures.
That's so amazing. I mean, this space is just going to really, really blow up. I know one of the companies that we work with called Media Probe, they do this in kind of the television and sports, right? When you're watching a football game or, an F1 race, where is that heightened skin response? When are advertisers getting the most bang for their buck? How do you kind of set up the production? But I think it all comes back to that original insight that, explicit versus implicit, right? That what people tell you explicitly is not always what they're feeling. And I think it's such a great point that when it comes to companies and brands, the emotions aren't very strong, right? It's not a love-hate relationship always, right? And getting to a finer level of sensitivity can have massive ROI. Right, that Revlon example. I mean, they would have just gone down the complete wrong path in terms of what the packaging should look like and what's going to get more product off the shelves. So this is, I think, it's really fascinating, and I think we're just going to see more and more of this.
Definitely, I think that's really worthwhile. We're remembering that the emotions that we're dealing with might not be as powerful as the emotions that we have about people, and it's worthwhile remembering that. And that's why we need technology to help us measure those smaller changes, those minute little changes that maybe people aren't even aware of they're having.
Fantastic. Well, Annett, this has been just an amazing conversation. I've learned so much about emotional detection and kind of where it comes into play. I mean, in some ways, I almost think you're right that most studies should have some emotional detection application, right? At the very least, try it, right? Try it in the next study, because you can measure pretty easily what's the difference between the implicit and the explicit, right? And if you find for the kinds of studies that you're working on or the types of clients that you're working with that there's a big difference there, then right? You're onto something, and you should probably be integrating the emotional detection further and further. And obviously for everybody out there, If you're new to this or kind of looking at how to kind of think about it, go check out Emotional Logic. I mean, Annett has been doing this for such a long time and is really the expert in this space. So thanks for joining us and sharing all of this with our audience.
Oh, thanks very much. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much for everybody else also who joined us.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll be taking a little bit more of an internal view at Question Pro and talking to our customer success teams all about how we kind of provide support, where we can help our customers, and just generally our approach to customer success. Annett, thanks so much for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend ahead. This has been a fun one.
Thanks. Bye.